Amen. Well, if there is a passage that you would like to cut out of the Bible, I think this is it. If there's a passage that would embarrass you as a Christian, I think this is probably it. There is the advertisement campaign. What happens in Vegas? Yeah, you know it, right? You've seen it. And what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas began as a way to communicate to adult vacationers that, hey, you can live it up when you're in Vegas, and it's not going to follow you home to work. You can do or live however you want to live. You've got absolute freedom. And you know, Israel must have found the same ad campaign company. What happens in Israel, Yahweh does not see. Live it up. They had that slogan was not a way of vacationing. That slogan had actually become a way of life for the nation of Israel. And what had happened is this: as God's people had traded in the 10 commandments for one commandment. They said, you know, I think we're going to be done with the 10 commandments. I'd rather have the one commandment. And what was the one commandment that they received? It was this: do right in your own eyes. Live your own truth. You do you, was the idea. And when we come to Judges chapter 19, what we are seeing is the complete Canaanization of the nation of Israel. That Israel had completely evolved into a secular pagan people, adopting the practices and the culture of their immediate culture. But you know, it didn't happen overnight. Right? What we're about to read never happens in a moment. It starts not with an action, it starts with a seed being embedded in our minds and in our thoughts. And as we kind of muse on it time and time and time again, eventually it bears fruit of some kind in our life. If we were in the New Testament, we wouldn't use the phrase the Canaanization of God's people. If we were in the New Testament, what would we use? We would say that the God's people were Corinthianized. Or if we were reading the book of Revelation, we would say that the people of God had been Babylonized. This is exactly what is happening in Judges chapter 19. Or if we were to use an American expression, we would say that the Christian church has become Las Vegasized. You see, when God's people, when we begin to reflect, get this, when we begin to reflect our culture's thinking, we end up living more and more like pagans and less like Christians. And this shift happens subtly. That pagan thinking begins long before pagan living starts. You see, in what ways has Israel begun to adopt their pagan culture? Well, we find it in Judges chapter 19, verse 1. It reads this way: in those days, when there was no king in Israel, a certain Levite was sojourning in the remote parts of the hill country of Ephraim, who took to himself a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. And his concubine was unfaithful to him. She went away from him to her father's house at Bethlehem in Judah and was there for some 4 months. Then her husband arose and went after her to speak kindly to her and bring her back. He had with him his servant and a couple of donkeys. And she brought him into her father's house. And when the girl's father saw him, he came with joy to meet him. Who are the Levites? The Levites they're the one landless tribe of the nation of Israel. They were not portioned a piece of land because they were to lead the worship all throughout the nation of Israel in every tribe. We would say it this way, that all priests were Levites, but not all Levites were priests. So a Levite who was not a priest probably was in charge of maybe cleaning up after the religious ceremonies had taken place. Maybe he was in charge of preparing for worship at the house of God, which was in Shiloh at this time. Maybe that's exactly what his requirements were to do. We really don't know. All we know is that he is of a very specific tribe who has been given very specific purposes as to how he's to conduct his life. Here's a Levite who has a concubine. What is a concubine? It's a strange word. In short, a concubine is a second wife. He would have chosen a second wife for one of two purposes, or maybe both purposes. Just to put it bluntly or plainly, he would have chosen his concubine either for sex or having more children. That is, the more kids you have, the more free labor you're going to get to take care of the garden. But this Levite, do you see how this Levite has adopted ungodly thinking in more ways than just who you marry and why? He's adopted the Canaanization thinking that it's okay to add more wives to your life. In fact, we're going to be so shocked by the end of chapter 20, but we're also intended to be alarmed with the first half of chapter 20. That both parts of this chapter are expressions of somebody who chooses to live their own way. And someone can live their own way with kind of great, heinous, dark sins, or somebody can live their way in a very morally upright, very suburban Cyprus type of way. But the expressions may be different, but the heart is the same, of living our own way. In verses 4 through 10 of chapter 19, it's an odd story. This Levite finally goes back to get his concubine to come back, and he wants to speak kindly to her. She invites him into her father's house. And basically, for the next 5 days, the concubine's father and the son-in-law basically have a drinking party, if you will. They become drinking buddies for the next 5 days. Each day, the Levite says, I think it's time for me to go. And each day, the man says, no, stay another night. Well, after the fifth day, the Levite finally says, no, I think it's time for us to go back to Ephraim. So I want to just give you a map as to exactly where they are. Here is, this square right here is just blown up here. So I'm going to go off this one here. So the Levite and the concubine and his family were living up here in Ephraim. She takes off and goes back home to dad, who's back in Bethlehem. The Levite and his servant take some donkeys and they follow her back to Bethlehem. They finally find her, and it's there in Bethlehem that they have that 5-day extended stay of living their own way. What I mean by that is this, is a faithful Israelite father would never give his daughter off into marriage, into a second marriage, right? Regardless of whether or not the guy's a Levite. We would say the guy's a loser Levite, right? And this is a guy who's not living according to the Word of God. And so this is the Canaanization of Israel, not just in what happens in the latter half of chapter 20, but the Canaanization of Israel of what's happening in the first half of chapter 20. And so finally, after 5 days, they decide to leave, and they go up to a city by the name of Jebus. The text says that is Jerusalem, and so we're thinking he doesn't want to stay in Jebus, he wants to stay in Gibeah. Why is that? Well, the reason why it doesn't have the name Jerusalem yet is because the people of the Jebusites are living in Jerusalem. So these are pagan people. Remember, this is right after the conquest, and they're in the Promised Land. And so the Promised Land has not been carved out just for Israel. And so the Jebusites are still living in that place called Jerusalem, but at the time it's known as Jebus. And so he says, no, we can't stay where the ungodly people are. I mean, after all, we're Jewish people. We're Levites. We're of the Levite tribe. And so we're going to go up and we're going to stay in Gibeah, which is of the tribe of Benjamin. So this is where all of chapter 19 is going on. And we come to verse 10 of Judges chapter 19. We read it this way. It says, but the man, that is the Levite, would not spend the night. He rose up and departed and arrived opposite of Jebus, that is Jerusalem. He had with him a couple of saddled donkeys, and his concubine was with him. And when they were near Jebus, the day was nearly over, so the sun is setting. And the servant said to his master, come now, let us turn aside to the city of the Jebusites and spend the night in it. And his master said to him, we will not turn aside into the city of foreigners who do not belong to the people of Israel. We will pass on to Gibeah. And so they arrive in Gibeah near dusk, and they believe, because no one has offered them housing, that they're actually going to end up sleeping in the city square. As fate or chance, if you would like to use that phrase, would have it, Another man from Ephraim offers them safe lodging and safe housing. He asks them, "Where are you from?" And the man says, "Well, I'm a Levite, and I'm actually going back to the house of God." I don't know if he was or wasn't, but the idea is that, hey, I'm a man of importance. And so the old man from Ephraim says, "Well, why don't you stay the night?" And so the Levite, the servant, and the concubine stay the evening with him. And the remaining portion of Judges chapter 19 is intended to shock us into the depths of the human heart. Genesis 19 is the record of Sodom. Judges 19 is Sodom 2.0. Israel has become like Sodom. Israel's anti-God thinking, and what I mean by anti-God thinking was not that they were against God verbally, but it's just that they had completely thrown off and cast off all the laws or the commandments that God had given to them. Their anti-God thinking led to anti-God living. And Judges 19 resembles, in a way, a picture of hell itself. It's godless, it's dark, it's painful, it's cold, it's terrifying in every way. And the evening at the old man's house, I imagine, begins with a round of drinks. Maybe some roasted goat, maybe some bitter herbs and some bread and some goat cheese. They begin sharing stories, and as they begin sharing stories, the old man hears a group of men coming down the street. This is not abnormal, it's very normal. He hears them get louder and more boisterous and somewhat obnoxious, but as they get closer and closer, and finally they're standing at the threshold of his door, and they begin beating on the door and yelling out, "Bring out that man that we may have sex with him." Bravely, the host steps away from the dinner and actually goes outside to meet with those men. And he says this to them. He says, No, brothers, this is wicked, and this is vile." And then he does what is absolutely unthinkable, not just in Jewish culture, but in every culture up to that point and to this point today. I'm going to read this story in its entirety. I'm in Judges chapter 19, beginning in verse 22. "As they were making their hearts merry, behold, the men of the city, worthless fellows, surrounded the house, beating on the door. And they said to the old man, the master of the house, 'Bring out the man who came into your house that we may know him.' And the man, the master of the house, went out to meet them and said to them, 'No, my brothers, do not act so wickedly, since this man has come into my house. Do not do this vile thing. Behold, here are my virgin daughter and his concubine. Let me bring them out now. Violate them and do with them what seems good to you. But against this man, do not do this outrageous thing.' But the men would not listen to him. So the man," that is the Levite, "seized his concubine and made her go out to them. They knew her and abused her all night long until the morning. And as the dawn began to break, they let her go. And as morning appeared, the woman came and fell down at the door of the man's house where her master was, until it was light. And her master rose up in the morning, and when he opened the doors of the house and went out to go on his way, behold, there was his concubine lying at the door with her hands on the threshold. He said to her, 'Get up, let us be going.' But there was no answer. Then he put her on the donkey, and the man rose up and went away to his home. And when he entered his house, he took a knife to the dead body, and taking hold of his concubine, he divided her limb by limb into 12 pieces and sent her throughout all the territory of Israel. And all who saw it said, 'Such a thing has never happened or been seen from the day that the people of Israel came up out of the land of Egypt until this day. Consider it, take counsel, and speak.'" This is unspeakable horror. And with the cold, kind of a calloused heart of a sex trafficker, after he pushed his concubine out into the cold, dark night, the man goes and lies down. Did he cover his ears with his outer garment so as not to hear? What did he do? The passage is silent. Her voice is silent. All we know is he wakes up in the morning, opens the door as if to get his newspaper, and sees a cold, lifeless body, and with equal coldness and with equal lifelessness in his voice, he says to the dead corpse, "Get up, let us be going." He picks that dead body up, places it on his donkey, and continues the trek back to Ephraim. And when he gets back to Ephraim, he goes into his house and he takes that knife and chops the body up into 12 parts and sends it into Israel. If this Levite is so grieved, if this Levite is so offended at what had happened, right? That's why he's chopped this body up and sent it out to alert and to alarm the nation of Israel. Look what has happened amongst the tribe of Benjamin in Gibeah. If this man is so aggrieved and so offended, the question is this: why did he not say a word? Why did he push her out the door? And where was he all night long as she cried out? And I want you to hear how this fraudulent, heartless, godless man of a Levite describes what happens in Judges chapter 20. Hear his side of the story as he seeks to put himself in a good light. Judges 20, verse 1. Then all the people of Israel came out from Dan to Beersheba, including the land of Gilead. The congregation assembled as one man to the Lord at Mizpah, and the chiefs of all the people of all the tribes of Israel presented themselves in the assembly of the people of God. 400,000 of them on foot that drew the sword. Now the people of Benjamin heard that the people have gone up to Mizpah, and they're nervous. The people of Israel said, "Levite, tell us what happened. How did this evil happen?" And the Levite, the husband of the woman who was murdered, answered, get this story. "I came to Gibeah that belongs to Benjamin, I and my concubine, to spend the night. And the leaders of Gibeon rose against me and surrounded the house against me by night. They meant to kill me, and they violated my concubine, and she is dead. So I took hold of my concubine and cut her in pieces and sent her throughout all the country of the inheritance of Israel, for they have committed abomination and outrage in Israel. Behold, you people of Israel, all of you, give your advice and counsel here." Benjamin had committed abomination, yes, but this man was of equal blame in his abomination. When it says that everyone from Dan to Beersheba, I'll show you the map here at the very top of the next map. You see that red circle at the very top, and inside there it says Dan. That's from Judges 18. And the Beersheba is the lower circle there to the south. The idea is this, is that everybody came together from New York to Miami, from Fargo down to the valley, from the very top of Washington all the way to Southern California. Everyone came together because they were outraged at this unspeakable horror. And if we didn't know the details of the story from Judges 19, we never would have thought that somehow this Levite actually contributed to her death by standing by silently, idly, not bringing aid to her voiceless cries. So what is the point of this gut-wrenching, soul-sucking, sickening story? Yes, the men of Gibeah are the villains, and they will be repaid in the next 2 chapters. They are worthy of a slow, painful death themselves. But the Levite is no better. The Levite himself is worthy of the same type of justice. What is going on here? There is a lot going on here, but I will say this to begin with, and that is, the Apostle Paul will write in Romans chapter 2 that religious people are in need of righteousness outside of themselves. And he will say in Romans chapter 3 that irreligious people also are equally in need of righteousness outside of themselves. That both the righteous and the unrighteous, the religious and the irreligious, are both in need of a righteousness that comes from outside of themselves. That all of us are in need of rescue. That is, these men, whether it's the first half of Judges 19, of two men living their own way, one willing to give up his daughter, the other one willing to give up his wife or concubine, both in the beginning and in the end, everybody is living their own way. Everybody is, if we can say it this way, everybody is seeking to please themselves. It's just that their expression of pleasing themselves is different. What does it mean to live my way? Well, to live my way means to do as I please. To live my way means that there is no authority over me. I am my greatest authority. That living my way is actually destructive for others and for me, not just currently, but also eternally. So what do we do with this passage? Well, I'm done with the exposition. I don't even know if you'd call that exposition. I just told the story. But I want to conclude by giving you 5 applications for us to consider from this story. 5 lessons of what it means to live our own way. And so that's why I've titled our message this morning, Living My Way, that is, doing right in my own eyes. Here's the very first lesson that I believe Samuel is giving to us through the book of Judges here, and specifically in this passage, and that is this, is that living my way acknowledges God in a religious sense, but not in an authoritative sense. Folks, the book of Judges is a reflection of a religious people who say one thing with their mouth, but refuse to acknowledge that God has any authority over them. This isn't just about this. The reason why this is Sodom 2.0 instead of Sodom 1.1 is because these are religious people. These are people who go to the synagogue or go to the tabernacle. Living my way, I acknowledge God religiously, but not authoritatively. It is clear from this story and from the book of Judges that it is very easy to be religious, but not recognize God as authoritative in my life. That it is actually possible to slap the name church on the outside of a building and not actually follow the words of Jesus or of the Bible. Probably the most egregious example, right? The most egregious examples of this would be something like this, right? This is true of the Catholic priest who abuses children, but folks, let's be equal opportunity offenders here. This is equally true of Baptist pastors who sexually abuse children. That to live religiously, but to reject that God has authority over my life in some way is to live with an expression of, I am choosing to live my way. This is, if you're below the age of 40, I don't know if you'll even get this reference, but you can YouTube it and figure it out. There is that old song by Blue Eyes himself, Frank Sinatra, where he sings My Way. I clicked on it this past week just to listen to it one more time. Beautiful melody of a song. But as he introduces that song when he sang it in Madison Square Garden in 1973, he says, this is the national anthem. And I thought to myself, yes, it is. And not just of our culture, but oftentimes of those who confess Christ. To acknowledge God in a religious sense, but not authoritative sense. It's true of a church member who embezzles, church of a believer who has an affair, or the Christian who gossips. You see, it's not just in the sense of some egregious sin. Yes, that is clearly what's going on here, but it begins in small ways by our thinking, and that gets us to our second lesson, and that is this, is that living my way suggests that habitual sin is not static, but progressively gets worse. When Israel was leaving, as they were leaving the desert and going into the promised land, I imagine that none of them, in fact, I would say, not just imagine, we know that none of them were thinking that this would ever happen, because they actually say that this has never happened from Egypt until now. How did this happen? It happens because habitual sins do not stay static, they get progressively worse. And we could open up kind of the Pandora's box of sexual sins if you desire, but the point is this, is whatever sins we habitually engage in, they don't stay the same, they progressively get worse. What was true of God's people in the Old Testament is true of God's people in the New Testament, that sin is a ruthless taskmaster, grabbing us by the throat and like a boa constrictor, winding itself tightly, tighter and tighter and tighter and tighter again. I know I used this phrase when I was preaching on Samson. It's true here that sin will take you farther than you want to go. It will keep you longer than you want to stay. And it'll cost you more than you want to pay. I would just say to us as a church family for a moment, kind of take off a prophet's hat and put on a pastor's hat for a moment. For individuals amongst us, you're here, you're maybe a member of Grace Life, or you've been attending for some time. If you have a life-dominating, deep, addictive sin, don't hide that in the corner. The gospel actually teaches us that that's what happens to us when we're left to ourselves. And that's actually why we need one another, why we need the Christian church. Pornography is killing us as a church. I'm not talking about our culture. Certainly it's killing our culture as the pornographic words fill our ears through pop culture and through media, but I'm talking about it's killing the Christian church. And I say this to us, that following Christ is not about perfection. Oh no. We're not arguing for some kind of perfective Christian living in any way, but what we are arguing for is this, is that we are repenting sinners, and that we are struggling sinners, and that we don't give up the fight against sin, that we seek to, that instead of be dominated, we seek to live submissively to the authority of Christ in our lives. When I say living my way, what do I mean? I mean by that living my way suggests that habitual sin is not static, but it gets progressively worse. Thirdly, living my way implies this, that there is actually little difference in my thinking as a believer and someone who's not a believer. You know, and we admit this, that we Christians, we are notoriously self-righteous people, are we not? We are so good at looking down at other people and doing tisk, 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 bad, bad, bad. Why would you do that? Can't believe you would do that. Don't you know I would never do something like that? And we think because we don't do X, whatever X is in your mind, and we do this, we do go to church on Sunday, that we are so much better. But brothers and sisters, do you understand that the actual actions of sin happen because our thought process has actually been corrupted by sinful choices? I do what I do because I think what I think. That the seeds of my actions came not from actions themselves, that seeds come in thoughts. So let me give you an example or two. You may value personal, and as a Christian I would hope you would, but you value personal sexual purity before the Lord for your children, but you're engaged in pornography. Do you see how that's incongruous to say, well, I don't do X, but meanwhile there's a secret sin? That's what Samuel's going after here. That those who put on a religious veneer act as if everything is okay, but meanwhile the corruption of the heart is brewing, and like yeast takes to a bread, that eventually it spills over the container or into the microwave. Or, let me put it this way. Here's a question. Talking about in our minds, that you may have been married for 3 decades or 4 decades, but you don't have any meaningful relationship, relational intimacy, emotional intimacy with your spouse. To say, well, at least we haven't gotten divorced. But brothers and sisters, if we're not valuing the person whom God has given to us, then we're no different, even if we did stay in the marriage. You see that? The living my way can express itself in various ways. That there is, to put it this way, there is kind of a suburban Cyprus way to live my own way, and there clearly is a Judges 19 Gibeon-type Benjaminite to live my own way. Both of them are wrong. One is more heinous than the other, but both of them are equal expressions of that I am living my own way. And what God is going after in Judges chapter 19 is to say this, is that though we may speak with our mouths and though we may have a religious veneer, that what God is going after is, do I have your heart? That we can try to paint the outside, if you will. We can try to dress up the outside, but if our heart is not worshiping God after what He desires, we are no better. This is why Romans 12 says to us this. Listen to this. Do not be conformed to this world but be transformed. How? By the renewing of your mind. He says, long before I want you to change your actions, what I want you to change is your heart. Here's the next lesson that comes from Judges chapter 19, and that is this, is that living my way reveals that eternal destruction waits for others and me. Living my way. Again, I'm using that expression as kind of a blank check. It can mean a 1,000 or a bajillion different things. But living my way reveals that eternal destruction waits for others and me. And I want to be gentle with this, but I do want to be clear. The Apostle John, when he's writing those short letters, right, in 1 John and 2 John and 3 John, he says something in there that is jarring to us. This is what I don't mean about living my own way. He says this. He says, if I do not love my brothers and sisters, do you know what he says next? The love of God is not within me. That if I'm not loving my brothers and sisters, then the love of God does not abide within me. Oftentimes I think about this even with the sense of when we're talking about being pro-life and the abortion issues, that it can quickly turn into a culture war. And people actually become enemies. But by this, all men will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another. That if I choose to live my own way without loving, specifically in this case, my brothers and sisters, that eternal destruction awaits. Again, the Bible is not in any way, do be clear on this, the Bible is not in any way asking for perfection. It's not in any way asking for kind of a sinlessness and, if you mess up, you're toast. No. It's not saying that. It's suggesting this. It's saying this, that we live under the authority of God. And when the Spirit of God convicts us, we repent of that. We confess that. Let me move on to the very last one. Living my way, then. Here's the final thing, and if this text teaches us anything, it teaches us this. Living my way demands this. Living my way demands that I have the saving judge to rescue me from my way. You realize there was no one who stepped in to rescue this woman. But brothers and sisters, it wasn't just that there was no one who stepped in to rescue this woman. There was no one to step in to rescue these men from themselves. There was no one who stepped in to rescue the Levite from himself, or the old man, or his daughter, or the servant who let everything happen. There was no one who rescued these individuals. All the judges up until this point clearly have failed. All the judges, that though most of them spoke on behalf of God, they all failed. You know, you may have had maybe a life addiction, whether it was chemical, whether it was pornography, whether it was food. You may have had many interventions in your own life of caring people. But what you maybe have often realized is this, that when those interventions happen, that you were still powerless to change yourself, right? You were still powerless to change yourself. Why? Because sin ravages, sin destroys, sin leaves us lifeless. And what Judges 19, that in the midst of this darkness, in the midst of this heinous wickedness, there is a faint light that is breaking through, not shadows, but is breaking through a pitch dark room of absolute wickedness. And that light is that there is a judge coming who is better than Othniel. There is a judge coming that is better than Ehud or Samson or any of the other judges that have come forth, of Deborah or Gideon. This judge is the one who is worthy to open the scroll. It is this judge who will give his life for we who have been ravaged by our sin, but we enjoyed it. We did not cry out. And it was he who stepped in to rescue us from our sin and from that sin around us. And the day that this judge died, Jesus Christ, the day that Jesus Christ died, demons whooped and hollered. And demonic forces in hell itself seemed on those 3 days to have lost their restraint and almost ran wild, if you will. And just when the angels of heaven were peering over the embattlement of heaven, thinking that all had been lost, and that the earth was to remain living forever right in their own eyes, for they had taken the Lord of glory and had taken his life and snuffed it out. Why? Because they did what was right in their own eyes. There was a voice from heaven. And this voice was louder than the voice that said to Lazarus, "Lazarus, come forth." This voice said, "My son, Jesus, come forth." And when this happened, the angels rejoiced. Why? Because now, not only were those who would confess Christ given the opportunity to do that which was right in God's eyes, but what else happened? That God not only gave us the opportunity, he gives us the ability to do that which is right in his eyes. And so we can worship right in his eyes. We can love right in his eyes. He restores to his marred, sinful, shamed creation the ability and the opportunity to do right, to live right in his eyes, and to worship right in his eyes. Why? For when Christ is the judge, there is not just a voice, but there is one who will step in to our darkness, who will step in to our misery, who will step into our shame and rescue us and redeem us from ourselves. Let's pray. Father, we thank you that in the midst of a dark, wicked passage of Scripture, there is